From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so my name is James Wintle. I am a reference librarian here at the Library of Congress, and I had a bit of a change of heart recently about what exactly I was going to do in this program. Initially, I was going to give a moderately interesting but possibly boring lecture about Purcell, and as I was researching the history of early music at the Library of Congress and the performances of early music at the Library of Congress, I came across something of a gem. And that particular gem happened on, yes, you guessed it, November 29th and 30th in 1962. And what happened on that particular day, or evening as it were, is that the actor Basil Rathbone, yes, the perplexed looks are appropriate, came to the library and with an Elizabethan broken consort gave a performance in which he read Elizabethan poetry and monologues from Shakespeare's plays interspersed with Elizabethan music. And it's quite stunning and quite interesting and not the sort of thing that one hears these days at all. So I decided to cast off my delusions of grandeur about giving a Purcell lecture and let everyone hear this thing that is so unique and so interesting and something that really just would not happen were it not for the Library of Congress. The concert series here is a bit of a unique animal in and of itself, and every once in a while we have these performances that really you just couldn't get anywhere else, because no other concert series is also associated with a Center for Poetry that can co-sponsor such a thing and put it on. So I wanted to give everyone a unique experience that you really just couldn't get everywhere else or anywhere else, and encourage you to go read more about Purcell, and you'll probably hear all the boring stuff I was going to say anyway. So that being said, just a little bit about the concert series for those of you who don't know. We're celebrating the 90th anniversary of the concert series. It was founded in 1925 by under the patronage of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who had a chamber music festival in the Berkshires and wanted her work as a chamber music patron to live on after her death, and decided that in order to do that, she needed to partner with a cultural institution that had the longevity that a person obviously doesn't have. So she picked the Library of Congress. She was friends with the person who was the head of the music division at that time, Carl Engel, and many of you have heard this before, but I'll just give this little overview for those of you who haven't. She was friends with Carl Engel, and her partnership with him enabled her to work out the details to donate money to build the auditorium in which you are going to hear the concert this evening. And there was famously an act of Congress that had to be passed in order for that to happen, because it was unprecedented that someone would donate a large amount of money to the government for a building project just because they felt it was the right thing to do. That sort of thing just didn't really happen, and still doesn't really happen. And so we have this beautiful chamber music auditorium thanks to the generosity of Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, and she is someone that we like to remember often in the music division because she sponsored so many wonderful commissions, especially mid-20th century. She was commissioning great works from Aaron Copland, from Bela Bartok, from Arnold Schoenberg, from basically any composer that you can think of that really made an impact. Prokofiev, just everyone. was writing music to be performed in this hall, and we continue that tradition today. This season, I think there are 6 new premieres. It's in the booklet. You can check my facts on that. But it's a wonderful series, and giving a little history of that series I thought was important, particularly as it regards early music, because there have been so many commissions and so many important commissions that have been premiered here and new works that have been premiered here. It is often forgotten that even from the beginning of this concert series, early music was very much a part of it. And there have been concerts, a number of concerts over the years by, for instance, the New York Pro Musica with Noah Greenberg has done medieval and Renaissance music here a number of times. Alfred Deller famously gave a recital here in the late 50s. And Mrs. Coolidge not only commissioned new works, but also commissioned modernizations of early music. And these are things that I mean, I've never actually heard them performed, but if they could be performed sometime, they will be performed here, not anyplace else, I'm sure. But there are these little corners of the collection of manuscripts that she donated to the library, like, for example, orchestrations of Lully arias by the American composer Roy Harris, who she commissioned to orchestrate these Lully arias for performance in the Coolidge Auditorium. And so the commingling of early and modern music is something that has a strong history here, and it's the early part of it that we will enjoy this evening, first in this concert, and then, of course, with Anne Sofie von Otter singing a beautiful, beautiful program. So what we will deal with today crosses over a bit with the earliest part of her program, and we're going to be listening to, in particular, Elizabethan music. And many of you, I'm sure, know Elizabeth I was quite an active lover and patron of music herself, and was quite a good dancer, and the idea of, or the corpus of dance music that came out of her reign was quite spectacular, as well as wonderful, sacred music and all the other things that we hear from that time. One of the great composers of the day, who we're going to hear later this evening, was John Dowland, and he is featured on the program we're going to hear in just a moment as well. He was not. He was a very well-known composer, particularly in England, and particularly in Europe, but never was able to get a position at the Elizabethan court. So he was constantly striving to gain the attention of Elizabeth and of the court. And so when you hear pieces on the program tonight, like the Earl of Essex Galliard, that's turned into a song, and different pieces by Dowland that have a little bit of a political bent to them, it's because he is trying to gain that attention. And he worked actually in Denmark for Christian IV, but published all of his music in London. And that is the real telling element of his career, that even though he was working in Europe, he made the trip, he made the effort to come to England and publish his works there, so they would be disseminated amongst the people and become the popular music of the day that it really was. And people talk about John Dowland as being a kind of folk musician of his day, and it really is true. Even though he was writing very sophisticated music, he was writing popular music. And that's something that a lot of people, I think, have lost, because we today think of concert music as one thing and popular music as another, when in fact that's only something that has happened in the past, 100 years, 150 years really, that the music that important composers were writing was not really thought of as popular. But in the Elizabethan era, it's very much that way. And so if you look at your program and you think, oh, well, why are there these pieces by Simon and Garfunkel at the end, right? It is, in fact, because that is the modern equivalent of what John Dowland was doing in the Elizabethan era, much more so than songs by, John Adams or something like that. It really is that side of what Dowland was doing that is important to represent and important to remember. So that will happen later. That being said, the pieces on this program are for broken consort. And that is not a reference to the fact that the lute was very easy to break, when in fact it was. But a broken consort is a group of instruments that are not all of the same kind. A consort of instruments in the Elizabethan parlance is a group of different sized instruments of the same kind. For instance, a consort of recorders, a consort of lutes. There were treble lutes, there were bass lutes, and in between. But a broken consort, which became a standard instrumentation, was a little bit of a few things. It was a treble viol and a bass viol. Treble viol, bass viol, flute. This is a dulcian, which could be doubled as a flute. This is actually no, it's not a dulcian, it's a bass recorder. So it could be either one of those recorders. This is a bandora, which was also called Pandora. If anybody listens to an app called Pandora, you have your music on it, you can think of bass stringed instruments from the Elizabethan era the next time you turn it on. But the Pandora or bandora, and this was basically a bass lute-like instrument. The cittern, which looks quite a lot like a mandolin, except it has this curved head on it, and the cittern is interesting because it had steel strings, and it was one of the few of these older Elizabethan instruments that did not have gut strings. So it had a really bright sort of cutting tone in the ensemble. And then, of course, you have the standard lute. So 2 viols, treble and bass, flute, and then 3 plucked instruments, the bandora, the cittern, and the lute. And this became a fairly standard consort. Within Elizabethan times, there were, of course, many variations on that. Any number of instruments could be a part of a broken consort, as long as they weren't just all the same thing. There were often virginals or other keyboard instruments, and you'll hear some virginal music in the program that is put on that we're going to listen to. But this particular core group of instruments is what is thought of as that particular consort. And this comes, it's sort of solidified in Syntagma Musicum of Praetorius. This is the standard for modern players who are looking back and trying to figure out how these instruments work together and how music was performed. This particular treatise, which is in 3 volumes, is critical for that. Another place in which the broken consort appears, and you get a sense of what exactly it was for, is in an anonymous painting from 1596 called The Birth and Death of Sir Henry Unton. And this is a strange painting that is in the portrait gallery in Britain. And after Henry Unton died in the 1590s, his wife commissioned an unknown artist to paint this piece that depicted him, death, and an angel on either side of his head, and he's writing because he was a scholar and a statesman. And then within the painting are 10 different scenes from his life, important things that happened to him. So it's kind of a biography of this person. And one of these scenes, which is here, depicts a group of musicians at an Elizabethan banquet. And you see people eating here. There's a room with people playing cards, and they have part books, and they're sitting around this table with a little kid who's doing something. I'm not sure why he's there. Then down here, you have another group that is similar to this group, but obviously different people. And they're in the main sort of dining hall where this is happening. And there are these weird sort of red-faced people walking next to each other. And I'm not sure what that's about. There's a whole procession of these guys, some candles, these guys, some candles, and then some more oddly dressed folks, who I assume are a theater troupe because they're going up here by the table to, I assume, entertain people and be much smaller in scale than the actual table. So that's a just something that happens in paintings at the time. But anyway, so you have this particular view of a broken consort in action. And you have the flute, the two viols, the cittern, pandora, and lute in a circle there, and then again up at the top. So there is that, and then there is the first book of consort lessons of Thomas Morley, which was a very important publication for consort songs and consort music in the time. And this publication, which says, if you probably can't read it if you're very far back, but it says the first book of consort lessons made by diverse exquisite authors for 6 instruments to play together: the treble lute, the pandora, the cittern, the bass viol, the flute, and the treble viol. And goes on to say things about how gentlemanly they'll be when they play them. But this particular publication is what inspired the consort group to put on the concert that we are going to hear. There was a copy of this book from 1599 that had come into the library's possession, and they were inspired by that to put on a concert of Elizabethan music. And as I said, Basil Rathbone, who did not play violin in the concert, but rather as Sherlock Holmes, which is great, he was the person who they picked to come and be the actor in that particular presentation. And this is the program of the concert. As you see, it was the Whitall Foundation and the Whitall Poetry Foundation and Literature Fund, which sponsored the concert. So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to a bit of this in the 25-ish sort of minutes we have left. And we're going to start with, let's see, if music and sweet poetry agree. So we're going to skip a bit of the first part and be about halfway down on the second page. But I'm going to go to the text so you can hear. Yeah, so at the bottom here is where we'll start. It says, if music and sweet poetry agree, as they must needs, the sister and the brother, then must the love be great twixt thee and me. Because thou lovest the one, and I the other. Dowland to thee is dear, whose heavenly touch upon the lute doth ravish human sense. And you'll hear what happens when he mentions John Dowland, since I'm probably not giving too much away, but slight spoiler alert, some music is played by the many other people on stage. So Mike, if you could start the festivities, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
If music and sweet poetry agree, as they must needs, the sister and the brother, then must the love be great twixt thee and me, because thou lovest the one, and I the other. Dowland, to thee is dear, whose heavenly touch upon the lute doth ravish human sense. Spenser to me, whose deep conceit is such as passing all conceit needs no defense. Thou lovest to hear the sweet melodious sound that Phoebus' lute, the queen of music, makes. And I, in deep delight, am chiefly drowned, when as himself to singing he betakes. One God is God of both, as poets feign. One night loves both, and both in thee remain. and sweet poetry agree, as they must needs, the sister and the brother, then must the love be great twixt thee and me, because thou lovest the one, and I the other.
Music from the Elizabethan era. We heard soprano Helen Boatwright in Where Griping Griefs by Richard Edwards, and Basil Rathbone reading Richard Barnfield's If Music and Sweet Poetry Agree to the music of John Dowland. Concluding this group was an instrumental masque by Thomas Morley from his first book of consort lessons, published in 1699. Morley's book was the original inspiration for this concert, which was devised and directed by Sidney Beck, for many years the music editor and research librarian at the New York Public Library. Mr. Beck made a critical edition of Morley's anthology as part of his research into Elizabethan consort literature and organized the consort players to perform it. His interest in the relationship of this consort music to Elizabethan poetry and drama was shared by Basil Rathbone, who collaborated with the consort players for about 2 years. Basil Rathbone begins this next group of selections with a poem by Ben Jonson, Have You Seen But a White Lily Grow? Immediately following, you'll hear an anonymous musical setting of the same text for tenor and lute, sung by Robert White.
Which is actually by Robert Johnson.
Have you seen but a white lily grow before rude hands have touched it? Have you marked the fall of the snow before the earth has smutched it? Have you felt the wool of beaver or swan's down ever? Or have smelt of the bud of the briar, or the nard in the fire, or have tasted the bag of the bee? Oh, so white, oh, so soft, oh, so sweet is she.
Have you seen but a white lily grow before rude hands have touched it? Have you marked but the fall of the snow before the smudged it? Have you felt of the bud of the briar, or the nard on the vine, or have tasted the back of the bee. Oh, so white, oh, so soft, oh, so sweet, so sweet, so sweet is she. Oh, so white, oh, so soft, oh, so sweet, so sweet, so sweet is she.
Tenor Robert White and lutenist James Tyler, Have You Seen But a White Lily Grow? An anonymous setting of Ben Jonson's poem. Basil Rathbone continues now with a sonnet by William Shakespeare, How Oft When Thou My Music, recited to a fantasia for virginals by Orlando Gibbons. Blanche Winegren is the virginals player in this selection, and the Scottish jig, which follows.
How oft, when thou my music playest, upon that blessed wood whose motion sounds with thy sweet fingers, when thou gently swayest the Warwick concord that mine ear confounds, do I envy those jacks that nimble leap to kiss the tender inward of thy hand, while my poor lips, which should that harvest reap, at the wood's boldness by thee blushing stand. To be tickled, they would change their state and situation with those dancing chips, or whom thy fingers walk with gentle gait, making dead wood more blessed than living lips. Since saucy jacks so happy are in this, give them thy fingers, me thy lips to kiss. I wonder how Henry VIII, you know, of the Dupois, ever managed to play one of those things. Well, he saw to it that his daughter Elizabeth played them very well. Also, her rival, Mary Queen of Scots. Can you hear her playing a Scotch jig? Most fitting, as Will Shakespeare says, wooing, wedding, and repenting is as a Scotch jig, a measure and a sunk pace. The first suit is hot and hasty, like a Scotch jig, and full as fantastical. The wedding, mannerly, modest as a measure, full of state and ancientry. And then comes repentance, and with his bad legs falls into the sunk pace faster and faster till he sinks into his grave. Blanche, dear, let's have a good old Scotch jig.
Blanche Winegren was the virginals player in the two works we just heard, a Scottish jig by an anonymous composer, and earlier, a fantasia by Orlando Gibbons. Our program turns now to Elizabethan attitudes on the subject of love. In these selections by John Dowland, Thomas Campion, and Thomas Ford, the scene is pastoral, Arcadian, and light-hearted. First is Dowland's The Shepherd's Delight, followed by Robert Greene's Sweet Are the Thoughts That Savor of Content. The quiet mind is richer than a crown. Campion's It Fell on a Summer's Day is followed by Christopher Marlowe's famous poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, and Sir Walter Raleigh's The Nymph's Reply. Thomas Ford's Sigh No More, Ladies ends this group.
Sweet are the thoughts that savor of content. The quiet mind is richer than a crown. Sweet are the nights in careless slumber spent. The poor estate scorns fortune's angry frown. Such sweet content, such minds, such sleep, such bliss, beggars enjoy when princes oft do miss. The homely house that harbours quiet rest, the cottage that affords no pride nor care, the mean that grieves with country music best, the sweet consort of mirth and music's fair, obscured life sets down a type of bliss. A mind content, both crown and kingdom is.
It fell on a summer's day, while sweet Bessie sleeping lay. In her bower on her bed, light with curtain shadowed. Jamie came, she his eyes, opening half her heavy eyes. Jamie
Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove, the valleys, groves, hills and fields, woods or steepy mountain yields. And we will sit upon the rocks, seeing the shepherds feed their flocks by shallow rivers to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. And I will make thee beds of roses and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cup of flowers and a kirtle embroidered all with leaves of myrtle, a gown made of the finest wool, which from our pretty lambs we pull, fair lined slippers for the cold with buckles of the purest gold, a belt of straw and ivy buds with coral clasps and amber studs. And if these pleasures may thee move, come, live with me and be my love. The shepherd swain shall dance and sing for thy delight each May morning. If these delights thy mind may move, then live with me and be my love. If all the world and love were young, and truth in every shepherd's tongue, these pretty pleasures might me move, to live with thee and be thy love. Time drives the flocks from field to fold, when rivers rage and rocks grow old, and Philomel becometh dumb, the rest complain, or cares to come. The flowers do fade, the wanton fields to wayward winter reckoning yields, a honey tongue, a heart of gall, in fancies spring, but sorrows fall. Thy gowns, thy shoes, thy bed of roses, thy cap, thy kirtle, and thy posies, soon break, soon wither, soon forgotten, in folly ripe, in season rotten. Thy belt of straw and ivy buds, thy coral clasps and amber studs, all these in me no means can move, to come to thee and be thy love. But could youth last, and love still breed, had joys no date nor age no need, then these delights my mind might move, to live with thee and be thy love.
No more. Men were deceivers ever.
One foot in sea,
And one on shore.
in one thing constant, never.
Then sigh not so, and let them go, and be you blithe and bonny, and be you blithe and bonny, converting all your sighs of woe
Into hay no money,
hay no nonny,
hay no money,
hay no nonny,
nonny, nonny, nonny, nonny, nonny.
converting all your sighs of woe
Into hay no
into
money,
hay no nonny,
hay no money,
hay no nonny,
nonny, nonny, nonny, nonny, nonny, nonny.
Elizabethan songs and poems on the subject of love, performed by Basil Rathbone, soprano Helen Boatwright, tenor Robert White, and the members of the Consort Players. The musical selections were John Dowland's The Shepherd's Delight, Thomas Campion's It Fell on a Summer's Day, and Thomas Ford's Sigh No More, Ladies. Basil Rathbone read poems by Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, and Sir Walter Raleigh. Basil Rathbone is remembered today as a film actor. He was admired for his appearances in films like David Copperfield, Anna Karenina, A Tale of Two Cities, and Captain Blood with Errol Flynn. and for many people he is still unforgettable as Sherlock Holmes. But years before the film era, Rathbone was already famous for his roles on the London stage. He was a very fine Shakespearean actor whose early stage career included performances of 53 Shakespeare roles, many of them at the Stratford-on-Avon Festival. We'll hear him now in Romeo's farewell speech at Juliet's tomb, Act 5, Scene 3, from Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, my love, my wife, death that has sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet o'er thy beauty. Thou art not conquered. Beauty's ensign yet is crimson in thy lips and in thy cheeks, and death's pale flag is not advanced there. Tybalt, liest thou there in thy bloody sheet? Oh, what more favour can I do to thee than with that hand that cut thy youth in twain, to sunder his that was thine enemy? Forgive me, cousin. Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair? Shall I think that unsubstantial death is amorous, and the lean abhorred monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? Ah, for fear of that, I still will stay with thee, and never from this palace of dim night depart again. Here will I remain, with worms that are thy chambermaids. Oh, here will I take up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace, and lips, oh, you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss, a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark. Here's to my love. Oh, true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Thus, with a kiss, I die.
which, as you heard, inspired this rather extraordinary program. You see in this program, I think the link that was poetry and theater and music, it really is inseparable in this culture. And when you listen to the pieces from this era, which are just a few at the beginning of the program tonight, I hope that you appreciate that and think about it not only in the context of what's happening on stage, but also in the context of the plays that you've read and the poetry that you've heard and the other experiences of that culture that you've had, and help it create a larger context for the music that speaks to you in that way. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I know it's a little different to sort of just play a tape for people, but I thought it was really worth hearing, and I hope you did too. And thank you all for coming. It'll be about 10 minutes until they open the house, so you have a minute to do whatever it is you need to do, which we don't need to discuss, and so you'll have a little time to get together and talk about Elizabethan poetry or whatever you need to do. So does anyone have any questions before we adjourn this meeting of the Basil Rathbone Appreciation Society? Oh, I will add that when the announcer was talking about his the great film credits of Basil Rathbone, he did leave out my two favorite Basil Rathbone movies, so I feel compelled by pure hubris and ego to tell you what my favorite ones are, like you care. And the first is, of course, Robin Hood and his performance as Sir Guy of Gisborne in Robin Hood. The great sword fight at the end with Errol Flynn is unforgettable. And the other that many of you may not have seen, and this is especially for the kids in the audience, Universal Pictures made a number of monster movies in the 50s, and the Boris Karloff Frankenstein was one of the best, one of my favorites. The sequel to that, everyone knows, was The Bride of Frankenstein. However, the third movie in that series was The Son of Frankenstein. And The Son of Frankenstein was the last one that had Boris Karloff as the monster, and it starred Basil Rathbone as Victor von Frankenstein's son, Wolf von Frankenstein, and it is a brilliant film. So if anybody likes monster movies, check out Basil in The Son of Frankenstein. You heard it here first, or possibly a number of times, I don't know. But anyway, anyone have any questions about the program or about the concert series in general, or my apparent love of monster movies? Anyone have any questions? Yes?
Just to be absolutely sure about the dates, it's 1599 because the narrator said 1699.
Could you repeat that? For the Morley?
Oh, the narrator on your recording said 1699, but your slide and your reference was 1599.
The Morley Consort lessons absolutely came out in 1599. It's definitely not 1699. That was, I know it's hard to believe, but a mistake on the radio? My God. No, but I know what you mean. But yes, 1599, absolutely true. 1699, just misread it. Anything else?
That only really seems to work with a British accent. Do you notice that?
There is a certain manner of speech I think we're all used to. I think the words are powerful enough to really withstand any accent. I could be proven wrong by that fairly easily. But I think of Shakespeare especially as a kind of unshakable genius, in the same way that I think of Johann Sebastian Bach. I hear Johann Sebastian Bach played on all sorts of instruments that he never would have heard of. And you can hear a Bach prelude played on almost anything, and it's still a brilliant piece of music. And I think that with this, you can hear it spoken with any accent, as long as the person knows what it means. And again, with the Bach, as long as the person knows what it means. But I don't think so. I don't think it has to have a British accent. I think we're just used to it that way. But I do see your point. It works better that way because it seems more authentic. And speaking of authenticity, in this program you heard the 1962 version of early music. They were in fact playing on replicas of early instruments, but the singers, as none of us have replicas of Elizabethan vocal cords, they were going full bore with the vibrato and all that, and very much in the style of that time. And these early music recordings from that period, you hear a very different sound from the singers, and in a certain way they dig into the music a little more because they give it more voice, and so there's a lot to be learned from this, I think, as a singer. Listening to these earlier recordings where they're just really discovering this music, I think can be educational. But a lot of the people, I was in an early music program in college, and a lot of the people in that program did not listen to this era of early music recordings and didn't, it was wrong, and so they didn't do it. But I think there's a lot to be learned, and I think that listening to these early tries at, this music there's a lot to be said for it. So I'm all for it. Anyone else have questions?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because 2 weeks ago you had Primarian here.
Mm-hmm.
They were founded in 1972, 10 years
Yeah.
after. And my wife and I, like Thomas Scholar, they were formed in 73.
Yeah.
So this is right before the early music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you had the Tallis Scholars in 1973 is very different than the Tallis Scholars today, and that whole sort of English church choral sound that influenced what we think of as what early music is supposed to sound like is, to a certain extent, a 20th century invention. So you have to sort of keep these things in mind. Yeah, but that's a great group. I love those guys. Questions? Anyone else have questions? Yes.
Did they use a different, so we used to the notes having certain frequencies and the scale today.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, were they using a modulated or somewhat different scale?
They were using a different scale. They were also using a different pitch standard. So what we think of as A440, it was lower than that. And in England, it was lower than that. In parts of Italy, it was higher. See, people think about, I'm glad we left a little time for questions, and I'll try not to go on about this, but the idea of pitch standard was a completely variable idea until the 19th century. And especially in the 17th century, you got pitch standards at widely different ranges depending on where you were in Europe. So parts of Italy, it was higher than we think of as A440. It was like A460. Other places in Italy, it was lower. And Germany, it was lower. And because Bach's pitch standard was A415, we think of A415 now as Baroque pitch, when in fact there is no such thing as Baroque pitch. There's German Baroque pitch, which is A415, and that's how we talk about that. And we know that from measuring the lengths of instruments, of organ pipes that still exist, that sort of thing. You can tell what the pitch standard was in any given time from wind instruments, that kind of stuff. So there is that part of it, and then there is also the pitch standard is one thing and the temperament is another. And the temperament means the distance between the whole steps and half steps in the scale. So the actual frequency difference in today's standard is called equal temperament tuning, which means in between every half step is the same number of frequencies in between each half step. In the 17th century, and in most times before the 19th century, that idea of temperament was variable. And so you had varying, because now in equal temperament, as they say, everything is equally out of tune. And we're just used to it, so it sounds fine. But as far as how the frequencies actually line up mathematically to each other, pretty much everything's out of tune. And what they would do in the 17th century and in earlier times, they would change the distances. It was variable between different half steps in the scale so that particular keys you could play on a keyboard instrument, particular keys were exactly mathematically in tune, and as you got further afield from one or two sharps or what have you, then it became more and more dissonant. And so the idea of dissonance in this early music is actually something that, unless you're sort of in the early music scene, you don't really tend to understand, because it's not only a half step next to each other being dissonant, but a half step that is tuned differently, being closer together possibly or further away in frequency, that sounds much more dissonant than if you just play two notes next to each other on the piano. So it's a whole different way of hearing music, and this is a great time to dispel a myth that is perpetuated by music history that sort of gets on my nerves, which is the idea that Bach wrote the well-tempered clavier for a keyboard instrument that was in equal temperament tuning. That is in fact not true. And he wrote preludes and fugues in all of the keys to experiment with a new type of tuning that was in fact not equal temperament. It was well-tempered, and it was some sort of variation on what they call sixth comma mean tone, and certain keys were in tune and certain keys were not. And the further afield you get from C major, the less in tune the actual key is. And so when you play, for instance, the B major prelude and fugue in the well-tempered clavier, it is purposely an extremely dissonant piece. There are many more accidentals, and it's much more harmonically adventurous because the key in and of itself was going to be dissonant. And so those pieces are written differently. If you really look at it, those pieces are written differently than the earlier ones in the book, because he was dealing with this different tuning system. So anyway, that is a whole other lecture, but is something that's interesting to think about when you're listening to this music, because some people go hear Baroque orchestras and they think everything's out of tune, because it's not what you're used to. And as people used to say, there are people who have perfect pitch, and then they get into early music ensembles and they have to develop different perfect pitches, so they can sort of think in A415 and that sort of thing. But everyone says that your perfect pitch is tuned to your grandmother's piano. So the whole idea of temperament is variable, is what that means. So anyway, other questions about stuff in general or other things? Music related, hopefully. I tend to be able to answer those questions more efficiently than other subjects. I don't know a lot about plants, that sort of thing, for instance. Yes?
I've never heard of a bandora before. Is there any difference between it and a theorbo?
Yes, there is a difference. Theorbo is basically a slightly, well, it depends on which theorbo you're talking about, but a theorbo is basically a lute with extra strings. And so the lute is fairly standard, and then there are extra bass strings that are not fretted. So you basically play the bass strings at whatever pitch you tune the string to, like a harp, and then play the lute like a lute. A bandora is a fully bass instrument. And I'll just get to this. As you see, the body of the bandora, well, you can't really see it from here, but the lute is rounded in the back, which gives it a different sort of resonance. The bandora is flat, and so it's about that thick, but flat on either side, and then shaped thusly with a little curlicue at the top. And it has double course strings like the lute does, but is pitched much lower and has a different resonance quality. Yes, it's lower, and it has a resonance quality that's slightly more flat than the lute because of the shape of the instrument. But the bandora that we think about as the bandora is the bass bandora, and that's what you hear in the Broken Consort. There were actually treble bandoras in the Elizabethan era. There were all sizes, and in one of the treatises, I don't remember which one, but there's a treatise that talks about the different sizes of bandoras and says that there is one small enough to fit in your pocket. So I assume it's some sort of large pocket, but it would be like something like this. So a soprano bandura is something that existed. I've never actually seen one. I've only ever seen a bass. But that's the essential difference. Anyone else? We're time? All right. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much, for indulging my love of Basil Rathbone. Thanks a lot.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.